Welcome back to another interview episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. We have a very special guest with us today. As longtime listeners of the show know, that I have a very particular obsession with one developer and one of their games in particular. A company where every time you saw that logo load up, you knew you were about to see something you had never seen before, something that was going to push limits that other developers would think, it's too risky, we're not going to do it. These guys just always went for it. That company, of course, is Dynamix, and we are here today with co-founder Damon Slye. Damon, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks. That was a really nice introduction. You made me smile thinking about Dynamix like that. Good to be here.
It's true. It's true. Okay. Before we get to that, though, we need to go. I always start off our conversations with finding out what is your educational background? Where do you come from before we get into game development and everything else?
I went to good schools here in Eugene, Oregon, really great high school, and then started University of Oregon, majoring in computer science. And then after about a year, I dropped out for Dynamix and did that until 93 or 94. And then I went back and got my bachelor's degree, but didn't have a degree while I was at Dynamix. I always thought I would. I always thought I was going to be a university type person, but the computer game bug got me instead. So that's why I ended up there.
Gotcha. Okay, now let's set the stage for this. So, Dynamix isn't your first game development. Where does the bug bite you?
Well, it really was actually in junior high. We had a teletype, and I started writing little games for a teletype. That's just like a typewriter with a computer on the back end, and so they're really simple. And then, really, it was more in high school. There was a Commodore PET that the physics teacher had. And it only had 8K. It was sort of a precursor to some of the really first 8-bit computers we know of, but the Commodore PET was much more simplistic. And so I started writing games for that. I wrote like a Snakebite game and a Mastermind clone, and then like a Star Trek game that was sort of involved where it was turn-based or whatever. And that's where I really got sort of addicted to writing games. You'd make a game and then your friends would play it, and it was cool. And so that was sort of first for me. And then I got some money and I bought an Apple II. And so I started programming on the Apple II. And then the first game I did was Stellar 7 for the Apple II. And we published that before Dynamix was founded.
Now, what year are you developing Stellar 7?
It would have been right after I graduated from high school. So like 1980, 1981.
Okay. And now Stellar 7 for the time is an extremely interesting product because you're dealing with 3D graphics, real-time action, computer-controlled opponents. What was how does this become the game that you're going to do on the Apple II? I mean, most bedroom coders are, a little less ambitious, let's say.
It started when I was playing Battlezone in a store, and a friend of mine, his mother walked by. She was shopping, and she said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I go, "I'm doing this. I'm playing this game." And she said, "Well, why don't you program a game like that?" And I said, "I could never do that. That would be so hard." And then it sort of made me think, well, maybe I could, And so then I got fascinated with 3D graphics and started doing research to figure out, how do you do 3D graphics on a computer? And there were some packages out there, like Bruce Artwick had done a 3D package or whatever. And so I was like, well, I guess it can be done. And so then I wrote my own graphics module for it and started thinking about how to code everything on the Apple II. I was sort of already fascinated with 6502 assembly language. I'd gotten into that in high school just because you couldn't make games fast enough in BASIC. At least graphical games you couldn't do. You could do text games in BASIC. You'd still have problems with memory and stuff, but anyway. So that's sort of where I got the bug to see if I could do it. I guess it was the challenge, and it just seemed fascinating. And you thought, oh, I could make lots of money. I could make $20,000. This would be amazing.
So, okay, so you've got the game. What steps do you take in 1980-81 to get this game into the hands of consumers?
Well, so I sent it out to about 10 publishers, basically everybody at the time. So I sent it to Electronic Arts, Sierra, Broderbund, I can't remember the other ones, some smaller ones. And also, I was working at a computer store with this guy that later became a co-founder at Dynamix, Jeff Tennell. And he was real entrepreneurial, and he wanted to publish it instead. And so I went with him instead of all these other publishers. Probably I could have got a deal with one of those publishers, but not all of them. Some of them didn't want to do it for various reasons. Like, well, Broderbund wanted to do it, but they wanted me to move down to wherever they were in California, which is funny because they started in Eugene, and get a job doing something else. They wouldn't give me any funding. And I'm just like, that's a crappy offer. It's like, no way. No. It's like, you want to publish my game, give me some money, So I thought it was a crappy offer, so I was like, no. And but we did send it out to publishers, and later on it turned out that they had noticed the game, and we ended up working with EA later because of that. But so I ended up partnering with Jeff Tennell, and we published it with him through a company he started called Software Entertainment Company. And that didn't work out. And so then later on, we decided to form a development studio instead and find a different publisher for it. And so we published it through Penguin Software.
Okay.
So first it was actually we self-published through Software Entertainment Company, and then we published through Penguin Software.
Okay. Now, what were the difficulties that you encountered trying to self-publish at that time?
Well, let's see. The biggest problem that he ran into, because he was doing the business side of it, is that you couldn't get distribution. And the reason is they wanted to do stock balancing, which is if you give them one game and they order 50,000 copies and then it doesn't sell, then what are they going to do with the game? Because we might be out of business and they can't get their money back, Whereas if they're a bigger company like Electronic Arts or Broderbund, they can trade and they can say, well, we'll give you copies of this game instead, because they're established. So basically they didn't have the trust to want to order the game because they have risk with their inventory.
Gotcha.
So that's what he ran into,
And so Penguin Software was a fairly big company at the time. What was working through a publisher like?
It was good.
How did it change the development?
Yeah, it didn't change the development, but I guess so. Then they wanted to redo the marketing, the package, the box, and everything like that. And actually, I wasn't happy with the box they ended up doing. They put a screenshot on the cover, and I didn't think it was quite as good of an idea. They had a reason to do it, which was they said, well, this game looks really great, so why don't we put a screenshot on the cover, But I don't think it was quite as good of an idea personally. But they were fine, they were nice, and they sold some copies and stuff like that. They weren't hard to work with at all, really. But they weren't super big. They couldn't really push a game hard. And I think we also ran into a lot of piracy with Stellar 7. So I think that really killed sales, because I think it was, well, everybody at the time that I ran into had played the game, but we hadn't sold very many copies. So something was wrong there.
Now, so was Stellar 7 the only game that you published through Penguin, or did you have anything else in the works with them?
Well, we also there were some local kids that were game developers too, and one of them, they were in high school. One of them ended up making a game called Sword of Kadash, and so we worked with him to get his game to market, and it was published through Penguin. And Sword of Kadash was a pretty cool game. It was actually a really fun game on the Apple II. It was sort of an adventure. Well, not adventure. You take your little guy like Indiana Jones and you run him around the screen in 2D, and there's traps and monsters everywhere, and then puzzles, basically like puzzle based, and then you go to the next room. And so there's 256 rooms, and everyone had its own layout. It was pretty cool, really. It was actually a really good game. And so that published them too. Yeah.
And so in that case, now you guys are your development studio, but you're also getting submissions essentially from outside And so how is the work inside of Dynamix? How does that evolve? I mean, it starts with you making a game. Then Jeff comes in to do some of the business stuff. Now you're getting an outside developer in. How does this snowball into a full-blown studio?
Well, it really was when we got our first contract with Electronic Arts. So what had happened was I got a call from the producer there, an executive producer at EA, and he said, "Hey, I saw your game Stellar 7, and it's really good, and we're looking for new artists to publish with." And so we just started business talks with them, and they pitched us some ideas. We pitched them some ideas, and they offered us a contract to build Arctic Fox. And it was very professional. They offered us $35,000 to develop the game, which back then was a lot of money for a game. Well, nobody was paying advances. So, I mean, that was a big deal. They actually gave us advances so we could afford to live and work full time on the game. And so we started that. And then while we're doing that, we were looking for other work. And they said, "Well, we have ports. Do you want to port Skyfox to some other computers for us?" And we said, "Yeah, sure." And that was more Jeff. Jeff was always looking for new revenue streams and new parts of the business. So he started getting all these ports up and going on the side, and so we started a port business on the side with Electronic Arts, and that developed a better relationship. So not only were we doing originals for them, we were also doing ports for them, and we just kept getting more contracts for more games as time went on. And that's sort of where we grew up and became professional, I would say.
Gotcha. Now, the port business is always one that's fascinated me because it's not an original development, but I can imagine that with the very different configurations and hardware capabilities of the different systems at the time, it must have been a challenge. How did one go about, for example, porting a game like Skyfox?
So in a way, Skyfox, I mean, it's a challenge, especially because the people that we hired hadn't really been game developers before to do the ports. They were smart programmer types, But in a way, Skyfox was easy in the sense that it was developed for Commodore 64, and we were porting it to 16-bit machines like the Amiga and the Mac. The Mac was actually kind of hard. It was kind of weird, like why? Because it was black and white, back then. But the Amiga version was cool. Oh, and we also were doing the Atari ST. So those three versions, they ported it to. And I think we had the source code, but it was all 6502, so it's not useful, So basically you're sort of, I honestly don't know how he did the port because you have to reconstruct all that game logic from scratch. So I'm not sure how he figured out how to do that. That's actually kind of impressive. That programmer later went on to work at Microsoft, and he was very good. But yeah, so in a way, it's a little less challenging than going the other direction because we ended up doing ports back from the Amiga to the Commodore 64, and that's like 10 times harder. Yeah.
Which games did you do in that direction? Arctic
Fox. So we developed Arctic Fox for the Amiga originally.
Oh, really?
So we really reached for the sky on that one. Full 3D, solid field graphics and everything, in a sort of a very robust world. And then EA realized their whole Amiga strategy was flawed because the Amiga was a total failure in the market. And so Trip Hawkins sent a funny email out to everyone and just said, because he had been the biggest evangelist of Amiga, like his face was just out there, Amiga, Amiga, Amiga. And they just sent an email and he says, "Well, if you know 6502, start coding, ha ha ha," which basically telling all of his developers to go back to the dark ages. And they're all like, "Oh, no, you're sending us back." Because at the time, after you work on a good computer, it's just like, oh, my God, you got to simplify all your visions and everything like that. And so it was just funny. But that's what entrepreneurs are good at, right? They can just change direction when the market demands it. And it did, because the Commodore 64 was selling like crazy and the Amiga was dead. So we just had to switch back to the Commodore 64 and start everything was C64 for about a year, maybe two. And so, yeah, that was the total target at that point, was the C64 until the PC finally took over. And it was hard, obviously, porting Arctic Fox back because there is no solid fill, for example. So I think the game's a lot less without solid fill, that particular game, because it was designed that way. But we pulled it off, and you still had gameplay and everything like that, so it's pretty cool.
Yeah. And I played it on both systems. I mean, frame rate on the C64 was, it took a little getting used to, but yeah, the Amiga version is a far superior experience.
Yeah. Even the frame rate on the Amiga could have been a lot better. So back then it was hard. 3 frames a second was good back then, But sometimes when it got crowded, it was like, the frame rates. They're just like, wow. Now I can't. Now I'm having a hard time getting used to it because people say 30 frames a second is too slow. I gotta have 60. It's gotta be at least 60. Yeah, it's like, wow. I used to think 12 was great.
There's. I'm trying to think of how to explain to somebody playing Red Baron on an Amiga 500. So theoretically, it was possible, but not something I'd recommend anybody try. Okay, so you guys are at EA now. What's your relationship with EA? Is it a project by project basis? Do you have some kind of contract where you have to deliver a certain number of products in a certain amount of time? How does it work?
Project by project. So every project was a separate contract, and it's all milestone based. So they'll give you an advance of maybe $5,000 up front, just at the very beginning, plus maybe some money to buy equipment, And then you meet a milestone, you get paid some more money. You meet a milestone, you get paid some more money. So it goes that way. And the challenge, of course, is if you fall behind on your schedule, suddenly you don't have enough money to make payroll, and then you're begging the publisher for more money, and you got to talk them into it, or you have to sign a new project to get more money in. That's just increasing your commitments for the future. So that's we call it robbing Peter to pay Paul. So we're just constantly spinning up new projects to try to keep the cash flow in, but then you're getting further and further in debt, essentially, future debt, Mm-hmm. So it's like you feel like you're a gerbil on one of those gerbil wheels where you're running as fast as you can just to stay in place, and you're not getting anywhere. And that's the problem. Unless you have some insane hit that's just massive. Back then, the business model was totally flawed to be a game developer. You're not going to get ahead. I think very, very few people got ahead back then. Some people would make enough money to buy a nice car, and then it was that, but that was the end of it, They try to do another project and it fails and everything. So it wasn't working. It was tough.
Now, EA always talks a lot about, in that era of them creating their own tools and stuff, were you also getting technical assistance from EA, or were you guys basically developing your own tech at that time?
The core tech, we did all of it. They gave great support with tools and hardware. So specifically, it was really the Amiga where we got assistance with. I don't think we got much help from them for the other platforms. But on the Amiga, they gave us a cross-development system where we're developing on a PC, and then we're working over a wire to the Amiga. So it wires all the code over to the Amiga, but all the compilers and linkers are on the PC, and you could actually do cross debugging where you're on the PC debugging what's going on the Amiga. So that they developed a really nice tool at the time. I think Amiga development would have been impossible without that. So that was fantastic support, but they didn't develop any of the code that actually ends up in the game. So none of the graphics or libraries or anything like that did they do. Later on, I think I did hear they started having some libraries they would share with their developers that they had created. But back when we were working with them, it wasn't the case. Basically, every artist had developed their own set of tools or their own set of code.
Gotcha. Now, while you're doing the EA thing, and I'm thinking now of the old song, "Sell Your Soul to the Company Store" type of situation. The Dynamix releases several very memorable titles. Among them, Caveman Olympics
Oh yeah.
stands out. Now, that was was that the first Dynamix game that gets ported to a console as well?
It's possible. I don't actually have a clear memory either way. So, but that could be
Okay.
because it had a nice concept. It was a high
Mhm.
concept, as EA would call it, high concept.
Yeah. Because I was just wondering whether or not Dynamix also did that port and what the royalty situation looked like, if that changed the fortunes of what that game could generate.
I don't think we did the console port. I could be wrong, but I don't think so because we didn't start doing console ports till later, and we actually didn't do that many. We
Okay.
did we did a few, but the way those deals work is, I think it's something like with Electronic Arts, you typically back then would get about a 15% royalty for an original game,
Mhm.
but if they ported your game, you'd probably get like maybe 5% if they did all the work, to something else. I could be wrong on the numbers, but that's approximately the kind of deal it would be, and it's probably in line with books and things like that. I don't know. I think the royalties were reasonable. The numbers that they chose. Some of the other publishers were a little higher. They were 20 to 25%. So EA was a little lower. Back then, I don't know where they ended up in the long run with all these deals because there's a lot of other parameters that come into it. Like how do they calculate royalties? Like a bigger deal is what do they deduct before they calculate your royalties? Because some companies can deduct everything and then you get zero, So you could have a 50% royalty but still end up with zero. So anyway, that's kind of, so we certainly didn't make a lot of money on Caveman Olympics.
Gotcha.
Well, we didn't make a lot of money on pretty much anything back then. Not so much later, yeah.
Okay, and so this brings us up to about, I think, 1988 or so. And how big is Dynamix at this point? How many people do you have full-time employees, or are the programmers and artists working under contract for the development house, or how does it work?
They're all employees. We didn't really have hardly any contractors at all. And we're probably 25. And so in that era, that time frame between, say, 1987, 1988, until we were sold to Sierra, we were between 25 and 35. So we were fairly robust at that point because we had a lot of projects. Especially when we switched over to working with Activision from Electronic Arts, we got a lot more work with Activision than we had with EA.
And that's wanted to ask, how does the shift from EA to Activision come about? Are you approached by Activision? Are you guys actively looking for new publishers to work with? What's going on there?
That would be all to the credit of my partner, Jeff Tennell, the business side of things. And so he was always looking for other projects because he knew we were always tight on revenue. So he would go out to other publishers, and he did a lot of work hustling we worked with Accolade, and we did, I think we ported Train. Maybe that was for Accolade. And so he had developed, relationships with a lot of these other companies as well. And so we started talking to Activision, and they were sort of becoming EA's biggest competitor back then. They were still sort of way, way behind, and they had a lot of internal problems back then because they had gotten smashed in the console wars. A lot of games got smashed by consoles because they stopped selling and they owned all this inventory that was just wasted money. And so we started talking to Activision, and we realized the business model that was set up with Electronic Arts would never benefit us. And so we would always be captive developers, and we would always be gerbils on a gerbil wheel. We knew we would never go anywhere the way the whole thing was structured. The 15% royalty was not enough to support us. Your odds of getting a mega hit are really small. Even if you get a hit, it's not enough money, really. So I think you'd consider Arctic Fox a hit, but it wasn't a mega hit, you know? So it was like a good seller, but it wasn't a mega hit. And even back then, mega hits weren't nearly as large as they are today. So we knew we needed to structure and get a new deal. And I mean, I was ready to quit at that point because I'm like, well, this isn't going anywhere, even though we were up to like 25 people, you know? So we finally just decided it's do or die. And so the deal with Activision was they would help us publish 2 games. So we would be an affiliate publisher on 2 games, A10 Tank Killer and David Wolf's Secret Agent. So we would be an affiliate publisher. And then we would do 5 games for them that we published under their banner. Ghostbusters, Death Track, Mech Warrior.
Die Hard.
Die Hard, yeah. And something else. Oh, I know. A game that never shipped, V-22 Osprey, I think. Yeah.
Oh.
And so
why didn't it ship? Oh, sorry.
It just didn't get done, I think. I think it didn't get completed. And there were some changes in the interim or whatever. But so basically we did 5 games for them and 2 games for us, and they were going to publish all of them. And we were able to get funding to fund the development of the 2 games that we were doing on our own. And so we thought, well, maybe that revenue stream will be a lot better. And so that's at that point we got up to probably around 35 people because we had a lot of projects in development. And Activision didn't have enough developers, you know, because EA had gobbled up all the developers. And Activision was struggling, you know, to be viable. So that's why we got good deals from them. And I don't know. Yeah, I'd say EA kind of screwed up because they should have probably found a way to keep us happy or whatever. But that wasn't their business model. Because at that point, we were probably one of the best developers. At that point, you know, we could do a lot of product, and it was good and it was high quality, and we had really good technology by that point. And we'd been through it. We shipped so many games that we had tons of experience, you know. So
definitely. Now at Activision, the Activision titles, the one that always stood out to me, and it was another one of these aha moments, and I know my listeners are wondering, wait, you jumped over something at EA, but the releases overlapped a little bit, if memory serves me right. So there were some EA games still coming out when Activision games were also coming out. Did that cause any friction at EA? Was there any kind of reaction to you guys having this development deal with Activision?
that all had to be negotiated. So that was all pre-negotiated before we signed the deals with Activision. So because they have these contracts that sort of, they're not exactly exclusive, but they're essentially exclusive. And so they had certain terms in their contracts that didn't allow you to go work with other publishers unless you fulfilled certain requirements to them first. It's called right of first refusal and right of first option. And so those things were sticking points for us. And so we had to negotiate a deal with Electronic Arts to get out of those contracts with them. And I don't remember the details of how that all worked, if we had to give them any money or not. And Activision lawyers might have jumped on our side and helped us a little bit, because those clauses were probably unenforceable because they were too restrictive on business. Like you can't stop people from making a living, basically. And they weren't really, EA wasn't really, so like so I think we ended up having to submit a bunch of game designs to Electronic Arts and saying, hey, do you want to sign these games? Knowing full well that they don't just go out. It's really hard to get a game signed with EA. And so they ended up saying no to a bunch of these ideas. And then we went around and said, okay, that's right of first refusal. That's first option. Now we're going to go publish with Activision on this. So I don't remember exactly how we got out of it, but it was work to get out of the deal. From EA's point of view, they were thinking, we've spent all this money to build your brand, because they had that whole artist thing. That was the original rationale for these. They said, we're building your name as a developer, and so that has a market value. So why should we do all this to build your brand up and then just let you leave and go with somebody else? But after a while, that brand thing with EA didn't work out that way. There wasn't a lot of value, like EA wanted to do like artists, like recording artists like Bruce Springsteen. Well, it never got like that. It was never like, whoa, let's look at that game designer. That guy's like Bruce Springsteen. It's like, who? It wasn't really like you're going to sell products just because it's so-and-so worked on it back then anyway. So it didn't really work out. And so really there wasn't really a lot of value being added by EA in that aspect, because I think that's an area where EA was just wrong. It didn't matter back then, branding the artists. So anyway, so yeah, that's kind of a long-winded story, but we had to negotiate our way out to switch publishers.
Gotcha. And so there was some overlap with some of the release dates, if I remember correctly, but you have these Activision titles, H.N. Tank Killer and David Fox come out a little bit later. I want to say 91, 92, somewhere in that area, right? But
it's probably 89. Yeah. It's probably 89. 88 or 89, yeah.
Okay. Because I'm thinking 89 is Project Firestart, and I believe 89 is also Die Hard, or 1990 is Die Hard. But I wanted to go back to... Yeah.
Huh. Okay. Gosh, I would think Die Hard... It's possible some of those were ported and the dates were later. Because in 89 we published Red Baron, when that was after we were switched to Sierra, so we were already done with Activision at that point.
True. I'm looking here at Moby Games has Red Baron down as 1990.
I think we shipped on December 31st of 1989.
Okay.
We put it on the last day of the year.
Yeah, it kind of missed Christmas, but probably still made the fiscal. So yeah. Oh, December 19th,
what it was.
1990. Oh Jesus. That couldn't have helped sales. That's weird. Okay.
Well, everybody said we were dead for missing Christmas, and they were wrong. Our Red Baron sold so much better than all the competitors back then. All the other games that made Christmas, and they just said, "Oh, you have to make Christmas. It's the only thing that matters." So that I thought was a good lesson, that product matters more than marketing. It's like you want to have the right product, and it's a few months late.
And it was the right product. It's another one of those games that I have very fond memories of playing, although I played it years later, but that's another story. But I was a very late adopter of DOS. I was an Amiga kid for too long.
Oh yeah.
But I do have to ask. So Die Hard comes out in 1990, and David Wolf was 89. Oh wow. Okay, yeah. This is no, Die Hard is 89 as well. So 89 was a big year for you guys. Lots of stuff coming out. The Activision games, especially that Die Hard license. I believe that was the first time you guys worked on an original product. No, you also did Ghostbusters too. So those two licenses, how did that work develop? What was it like to shift from working on stuff that you're creating to having to work on a licensed product?
It was a little different because then you are bound by certain pre-existing constraints or whatever. So I didn't work on those two games. So in a way, but I did work on Mech Warrior. I did the original design for the PC version of Mech Warrior, so I know what it was like. And so part of it is, what does the license mean? Is it mostly a marketing-driven license, or is it a gameplay-driven license? So Mech Warrior were sort of gameplay-driven, because like you want to copy their gameplay, as well as get the marketing, which I think is a better license, because you're actually getting a lot of value. Because Mech Warrior was a great design. The original board game was a great design, And so, but with something like Die Hard, well, the movie has nothing to do, with the game other than you run around and shoot bad guys, So anyway, so it's a game like Die Hard. It's you're basically just trying to get some of the images into the game, and it's not that hard. But not Bruce Willis's image, because we didn't have we didn't have the license for him, so we couldn't put his picture anywhere. So it had to be a guy, but the guy couldn't look like Bruce Willis.
And there's all the images, and it's a game that uses a lot of scanned imagery, especially on the DOS version, where you actually have the characters are moving around in a 3D environment, but they're scanned sprites. That must have been a fun day to find out, you can use everything but not Bruce Willis.
Yeah.
That was an interesting conversation.
Well, yeah, we tried to get a license, but we talked to his agent, and his agent was one of these typical marketing guys, and he's just like, Bruce Willis doesn't get out of bed for less than $150,000.
Oh, Jesus.
So he's just like, he's a big deal. And we're like, no way are we paying that much money for him to get out of bed, So, yeah, because maybe we thought we'd get his voice digitized or something, So, no, that was a no-go. But Activision paid for the license for Die Hard and for Ghostbusters 2, so we didn't have to pay those licenses. It's possible that some of that money got deducted off the top before we got our royalties. That would be typical.
Gotcha.
So something like that. So, but we didn't have to pay the license ourselves.
And it was also weird with Ghostbusters 2 because there was all the other home computer versions were done by UK studio. And they were completely different from the game Dynamix delivered for DOS. Was there any discussion there why Activision was doing two different versions of that product?
I don't remember any discussion about it, but I wasn't really actively involved with that project. But it would be pretty normal for a publisher just to work with different people. And I mean, it could have even been different producers at Activision. It probably was different producers. Wouldn't be surprising if one producer says, well, you get the console rights and you go talk to them and build a game and vice versa.
Gotcha.
It could have been useful to share some work, but I don't know, coordinating that kind of stuff was pretty hard back then. So.
Gotcha. Now, before we get into the two titles that you guys published through Activision as affiliate, I do have to go back to, and we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, Project Firestart. I just have to talk about this because, number one, extremely unique game for its time, a somewhat troubled development history. How does this project, what's the birthing moment of this project while you're still at EA, because it is an EA title?
Yeah, so we were working with the producer there, our producer, executive producer, I think it was the term they used, Joe Ibarra, and he had done a lot of top-selling games there. I think he was Bard's Tale. He worked with Brian Fargo, and he did Starflight. That was a big title. I can't remember all of them, but he was sort of they had four main producers there. And we had done Arctic Fox with him and some other projects, but he was always trying to get us to do other types of games. And so he wanted to do movie games. In fact, the original game we pitched to Electronic Arts was a movie game that was sort of like based on Indiana Jones. We had pitched a game like that originally before Arctic Fox. But he wanted to do something, and sort of his inspiration was the game called Karateka. Do you remember Karateka? So it was a really simple, a really simple side scroller, but really nice and very cinematic. It's just a side scroller, but it's only got like maybe 5 screens this way. And so you're telling a story without like a lot of dialogue, and so it's very cinematic, and there's good gameplay, and so. For some reason, it really interested Joe, and then Jeff was actually also really interested in making movie-style games on computers. I was not as interested just because I liked I like the media. I like games. I like the interactive elements and stuff like that. But still, I was sort of fascinated in trying to analyze and dissect movies and their language and how they work. And so I ended up reading a ton of books on movies and what are the techniques and how do you build suspense, you know. And so some of that stuff ended up being really interesting to me. So suspense, you know, I read these books and they said literally it's when you have something really important about to happen and then you cut away and the viewer's just like, what? And so that's why in Firestart there's these scenes of where the monster's trying to get to the room with the girl. You know, it's like, oh, and you see it, bang, 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 and then it cuts away. They're like, ah! It's like, it works, you know?
Oh, totally.
So that was fun, you know? So that part of Firestart was really fun to work on. And then trying to scare the person, you know, that's a lot harder on a Commodore 64. Try to creep them out, you know. I think you can back then you could creep them out a little bit, but you couldn't really scare them too well. There was a shot in Firestart where the monster appears. Well, it takes like 20 seconds for the picture to load off the disc, and then it appears, and it's kind of like, ah. Whereas we wanted to just go, blah. Actually, you see it now on those YouTube videos that say, can you see what's wrong with this picture? And they go in really close, and the monster jumps up, you know. We're trying to get that kind of moment. And anyway, so yeah, Firestart was fun. And so yeah, that was sort of the inspiration, was to try to do a movie on a computer. And EA was always stretching, like, can a computer make you cry? Can a computer make you, you know, laugh, you know? So it was like, can a computer scare you, was, I guess, what you'd say Firestart was about.
Gotcha. And so you guys start this project, what year is that approximately when you're doing this initial development?
It's probably 87. When did it launch? 88?
89. March.
Okay. Okay, early 89. Okay. Yeah, it's weird that it's weird because that is an overlap with Activision. But yeah, probably most of the development then took place in 88 would be my guess. Unless Moby Games got the dates wrong. But yeah, probably right around there.
The reviews also came out in 89
okay.
in the magazines.
So yeah, we were probably working on it in 88 then.
Yeah. So you've got this idea, you're developing this, and I have to ask, Commodore 64 is the platform of choice just because of market conditions? Is it some technical aspect of the machine that's making it more viable, or why the C64 is the development platform for this?
Just because that's what all the computers were out there that consumers owned, you know. So, and I think that's probably because it was really cheap, and the graphics were really good, you know. So the Amiga, the graphics are better, but it's not really cheap, you know. Commodore 64 had hit a price point that was affordable for tons of people. So it was the computer people would buy for their kids on Christmas, you know. So that was the reason. Just, you know, games weren't selling on other computers at that time very well at all. Commodore 64 sales were way higher.
Gotcha. And now obviously a 2-year cycle or almost 2-year cycle. Was that typical for the time for development, or was that longer than expected?
No, I'm sure even on Firestart it was less than a year or right around a year. Pretty much
really?
Everything was right around a year. It's possible it was even done in 88 and didn't ship until 89. I don't know.
Gotcha.
But pretty much there was nothing that took more than a year. I think maybe the first game I worked on that was over a year was Aces of the Pacific, and it was probably a year and 3 months. So 15 months probably was Aces of the Pacific. And that was the longest game I had worked on. Wow. Before that, they were all a year or less, like right around 11 or 12 months. Some might be 9 months, but yeah.
Gotcha. Now, that begs the question: how much control did you guys have as stakeholders in the product concerning the release schedule of a game like any of these games?
Well, pretty much we were always aligned our interests with the publishers, because the longer we go to release the game, then we run out of money, because they were all milestone-based contracts. So we're trying to get the game done too, just so we don't run out of money. And it probably wasn't until we did our own games that when we self-published where we wanted to extend the schedule. So say A10 Tank Killer was the first game where it's like, this game has to be good. We want to spend more time. And then Red Baron really was that way. But before that, we didn't. We wanted to get the game out. We didn't want them to be crap, obviously, but there was a strong pressure to get onto the next project, because you're running out of money.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned in our when we chatted beforehand that you guys were pulling some tricks to make Firestart work on a C64. What were some of those graphic tricks?
So one of the things was just to get some of those nice, really cinematic scenes. I think in particular, there's one where you're running through the tube. So the tube's connecting two parts of the space station, and you can see the stars behind you, and there's different planes of scrolling going on. And so there's a lot of sprites on the screen to handle all of that. And so we actually had more than the number of sprites the Commodore had available running simultaneously on the screen, which is just kind of really cool and mind-boggling. It's like, I don't remember how many sprites it gave you, maybe 16, and maybe we ended up having 32 sprites. So, but the trick is that there's an interrupt on the Commodore 64, and you can interrupt along the screen, and you can say, when you hit this line, this interrupt happens, and basically that means run some other code. And so suddenly what you do is you'll sort the sprites, and you'll say, the sprites are up here. Okay, but when we hit this point, we flip the sprite buffers and change them around completely. So when the raster scan hits here, poof, we switch and we'll have these other sprites, and it works. It's really cool. So it's a cool trick, yeah. Because the sprites were super fast on the Commodore 64, right? It was all on the chip, so you didn't have to blit them out. You didn't have to write them to the screen because it was all done in hardware. So that was a really cool trick that we came up with for that. And I think you kind of needed that for the immersion. So in a way, that actually affected the quality of the game more than just having nice graphics. The game was more immersive because the graphics could support the mood and the scene.
Gotcha. And the game, the stories I've heard, at least, it didn't sell tremendously well. There wasn't a lot of advertising in the magazines or anything for the title. Is there a specific reason for that that you know of, or was there just no confidence from EA in the title, or was it because you guys were already heading off to Activision? What happened there? Because I haven't found a single ad for it anywhere in any of the magazines. It's just like it never existed from a marketing standpoint.
Yeah, I think there were some ads. Personally, I didn't think the cover art was good enough,
Oh, yeah, that was terrible. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. They were trying to get in. I don't know. I guess I can't say. I mean, I don't know. Maybe the game was. I mean, I thought it was cool, but you thought it was cool.
Oh, for me, it is the game that I've still put on a pedestal above all others. There's an experience in that game that I don't really think any other game has been able to capture, especially with the hardware limitations.
Yeah.
It's just a whole new world.
I guess I don't want to point fingers, but I do think EA probably didn't do a very good job marketing it. I don't think the cover was very good, and I don't think they pushed it very hard. I think they could have tried to get the creepy angle more. Well, let me just grab the box real quick.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just don't think that covers all that is quite as good as. I think the game quality is higher than the quality of the cover.
Oh,
they're trying
definitely.
They're trying to make it look like Geiger's art, I think.
Yeah.
That guy that did Alien, but it's not that high quality. Now, I kind of like the back cover a little bit. Actually, I thought this was okay.
Yeah.
Because screenshots from the game, and they show a lot of different scenes, so I think that's kind of good. Although it's a little gruesome because they show the lady you're trying to save, like her arms cut off. I'm not sure I would actually put that there. It's a little too much.
Exactly.
Because that's the idea.
Or
of
the shot
suspense.
of
You
the
want to leave that up.
exploded heads. The
Yeah.
exploded heads in the bottom left.
Yeah. I'm not sure I'd put them. You want to build suspense, but there's that scene I was talking about with the fancy sprite stuff going on with all these different planes or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I guess that's not. I just don't think it's a very good cover, personally.
No. Did the fact that it
Probably
came
for
on
market dollars.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. The fact that the game was shipped on 2 floppy disks, it was 4 sides, 4 sides in total. Was that ever a consideration? I mean, was anything like the material cost for producing units of the game ever a consideration towards your contract with EA or the kind of revenue the game might generate?
I can't remember if the contract allowed them to deduct cost of goods. Probably it did. So probably it did reduce our royalty a little tiny bit. Back then, we were very concerned with the number of discs we shipped in a game. Later on, publishers just didn't care. At least Sierra didn't care. Sierra was just like, we don't care. Put more discs in there. Who cares? And so there were some games that would ship with 12 discs or whatever. And they would actually, there was a terrible time where games would ship with 6 3.5-inch and 6 5.25, because they didn't know which format the user had of disk drive. And it's just like, what? That's a waste. Because they didn't want to have 2 separate SKUs, because then that causes problems with the stores. So they put it all into one box and say, oh, it works on either one. But
yeah,
it wasn't really a big factor. Well, I'm sorry, with EA, and at that point, you did care a little bit about the number of discs, so you didn't want it to explode into a huge number. And so 2 probably was a little bit like, we just can't fit it on 1. We just can't, pull it off.
In Project Firestart, there are a whole bunch of rooms that don't seem to have any actual direct function on the actions of the player. Or at least the actions the player has to perform to complete the game. Things like the holodeck and the observation deck tower and stuff. How did you envision the role of those locations in your original design? Did that change during the game's implementation? So were those originally going to be more beats in the game? And that's what the rooms were there for? Were they always just there for atmosphere? What was the design philosophy behind those extra rooms?
So it was the idea of building the world and then figuring out what the gameplay goes into that world. So sometimes you might think, oh, we'll figure it out later, what's going to go there. And then you might not think of what that is, or it might not just fit into what you're doing, So, which is normally not like, say, how a movie doesn't work that way. They start from the script and what are the plot points that need to happen, and then they describe each. Because building sets in movies is really expensive, so you don't build a set that doesn't have any purpose, because that's what they say is money that doesn't end up on the screen, So some of those things were just done that way, like, oh, here's the space station. Let's figure out what the map is and what are all the different places and what should be on a space station. So you work it all out, and you're like, well, we'll figure out what the gameplay is later. So it can be a little bit wasteful with budget or whatever, because usually you want every asset in the game to somehow be tied to gameplay. That's just sort of a general idea that you want gameplay to work with art, to work with player action, to work with rewards. You want all those things working together. So when you have an asset that is just pretty, usually it's not as effective. But if it looks really cool, you might just keep it anyway, just for the atmosphere,
Well, and it worked phenomenally because it actually felt like a living space, and it did. I want to say it was a little bit subversive of many expectations when playing the game, because you were so trained that every single room, every single space in a game had to somehow have a function in the total game, be it a point and click adventure game, or if you played something like Prince of Persia, where the layout didn't feel like a realistic space. It was just basically, this is the next challenge to get through.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I like that. I mean, it wasn't intended to do that. We weren't trying to be subversive, but I also sort of just like the idea of having a world that's authentic, even if it doesn't have because it builds some of the realism, the feel of realism, and maybe it gives the players a chance to breathe a little bit where there's nothing going on.
Oh, definitely. I mean, just the exploring and mapping out the place, that was the true thrill, because you didn't know, does it have a function? Does it not have a function? And by the time you finally realize, wait, this is actually just the space station.
Yeah.
And then you're concentrated on, okay, well, I'm in the space station. This is my mission. And then you start figuring it out from there. It actually made you feel like you were in that space, as opposed to, well, what's the mechanic? So there was not that distance that you normally have in a game where you're constantly reminded it's a game.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's cool. That's cool. It wasn't intended, but I like it that it worked out, obviously.
Oh, I've done my diatribe on the game already. So, yes, we've got the EA games done. We've got the Activision, the normal Activision titles done. The two games that you guys did as affiliates for Activision. Now, were you involved heavily in both of those titles, or did you concentrate on one or the other, or were they done in parallel? How was the development of those two titles?
So that year, we had 7 games in development for Activision. And I think we actually had, as I recall, actually, we were finishing up some games with EA, like came out of Olympics at the same time, now that I remember. And that might have been part of getting out of the deal with EA. Maybe we had agreed to do another game for them or something. But so I didn't work, well, no. I was working on Mech Warrior and a little, not really very much on V22 Osprey, but a little bit, because it was a sim. But I worked on Mech Warrior, and then after a while I realized I just can't handle this. It's too much work. And so I just sort of did the original design based on the book, and then I was focused really on these two, David Wolf and A10 Tank Killer, and I saw A10 Tank Killer through to the end, just managed the whole project of the design. David Wolf, I designed it and I went halfway through development, and then I gave it over to Jeff. He wanted to finish producing it, and I think he did a better job finishing it up than I would have done, just because he wanted to do movies and stuff like that. And to some extent, I wasn't into the whole movie thing on a computer as much. I think the immersive way is more interesting. Like you look at a game like Doom. To me, a game like Doom is almost a movie on a computer, but it's just a 3D environment that's very immersive. I think that is how you do it. You don't tell linear story on a computer. Although some games do it, but it's just a different kind of an experience, telling the linear story where you go through it down this one path. So anyway, yeah. So I worked on them both, but I only managed the development of David Wolf to the halfway point.
So after moving from the C64 and Amiga systems with fixed hardware specs to DOS development primarily, what was the process for deciding on target hardware configurations for your game designs? Was that an issue? How did you guys go about figuring out, what should be the system specs, the minimum and recommended?
So initially, we wanted to run on everything, obviously, because we wanted everyone to be able to play the game. And so we would start from that point of view, and then we would just, if we knew the game just couldn't run on a device, then we would, list that and say, okay, we can't run on that, Like I think there were some early PC Juniors or Peanuts or something that we couldn't. We were just like, we just can't run on this, So that basically we tried to run everything that we could. We wanted to be as mass market as possible, So you'd always have different versions based on the specs. So especially the graphics card. So we'd have CGA or VGA, like that. So we try to, and you basically just look and see what percentage of the market that computer is, And so, for instance, we supported CGA much longer than we wanted to, but but we don't want to give up the sales, so people can play with 4 colors, and then EGA was around for a long time, even after VGA came out, and EGA, we did a lot of EGA games. EGA was pretty good. 16 colors was pretty good. You can get all the ideas across with 16 colors. Like with 4 colors, that actually kind of affects the gameplay because you just don't have enough signals, for the players. But 16 is pretty good.
Gotcha.
So we tried to run on everything, and then we tried to support specialty devices if they were part of the target market. So, for example, we were doing flight simulators, so we'd support all the Thrustmasters, all the fancy joysticks that came out.
Gotcha. Were there any memorable features or design ideas that had to be scrapped in order to keep that low end of the market open to you guys?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we basically were, we were targeting the designs in terms of our vision was basically targeting what was already out there, and basically we had been developing for the Apple and the Commodore 64. So the PC was already better than that, in most ways, not in every way. Like C64 had more colors than a CGA PC, but mostly our design vision was already, we were already targeting, the market. So there weren't a lot. I mean, what eventually started happening was you started having more memory and you start using it, and then you would start dropping the low end computers because they didn't have enough memory anymore, and you got used to using it. So I don't really remember anything like that. Now, see, if we'd started at a different time, like maybe if we'd done Doom type graphics, with all the textures, that might have changed that calculation a little bit. So yeah, it didn't really affect us, and so and a weaker machine can still run the game. It's just the frame rate's not going to be as good.
Gotcha.
So yeah, so we'd have to add special features to support them, like time scale, for so it can support a lower frame rate. And basically, you don't want the simulation time tied to the frame rate, so you have bigger increments or smaller increments for movement and stuff like that.
Interesting. Okay. Never actually thought about the fact that the frame rate and the simulation would be running separately, so to speak.
Yeah, so at first, when you're developing a game like, say, Stellar 7, the frame rate, nowadays we call it like the tick. Sometimes you'll call it a tick. So 1 tick. And so your frame rate the machine is the same for everyone. So you know exactly how the game's running. And then eventually, when you have to support a wide breadth of different processor speeds, you have to decouple the simulation from the tick or the frame rate, because normally you just, like, say on an Apple II, you might say something like, oh, this tank can move 20 units every frame. And so then you just have a loop that goes and says, process the simulation, render a frame, process the simulation, render a frame. Well, when you don't know how long the frame takes to render, it might be that like, say, if you're playing a flight simulator, the planes are going way too fast or way too slow, So you have to, basically what you do is you say, well, how much time has passed since the last tick, and that's how far I'm going to move the airplane, like that.
Awesome. Okay. I never thought about that. It would probably also explain some of the old DOS games running super, super fast in the Windows 95 era because they didn't decouple.
Yes. That's exactly correct. And it was something that everybody came to realize. Oh, we have to decouple the simulation speed from the frame rate speed, and then you do that, And then at that point, you would actually have a separate tick for the simulation and say, oh, we're running at 30 ticks per second for the simulation or whatever it is. You go through a loop, and basically that's working with inputs and things like that. So.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, I never even thought about that. That's cool. Okay, gotcha. Now, all three of these titles, MechWarrior, A1010 Killer, and David Wolf, rely heavily on 3D engines. Now, how did Dynamix's 3D technology evolve starting from Stellar 7 all the way through? Was this a continuous upgrade? Were you what was your philosophy or approach as a studio and you yourself towards this kind of game technology?
So I think going back to the port of Arctic Fox. So Arctic Fox, we were building everything from scratch every time up until that point. So Arctic Fox for the Amiga, we built it from scratch. So I knew all the algorithms from Stellar 7 but we were porting it to C now instead of 6502. And so writing the engine, and then when we wanted to port it back to the Commodore 64 and the Apple, it's like, man, this is a lot of work. How do we do this? And the first thing you see is, well, the Apple II and the Commodore 64 are almost the same machine, right? Except for some graphics calls. Like, how do you draw a line? So it's like, well, we just write a different routine on the Apple II to draw a line versus on the Commodore 64 to draw a line, or a different routine to initialize the screen or clear the screen, And so nowadays those things would be called a platform layer, But the 3D code is all the same on both. It's identical. It's the same exact code, but these primitives, the platform layer is the same. I'm sorry, that's the only part that varies is the platform layer. And so then you just say, well, you factor out everything that's common and from what's not common. And so you now create, and back then we called it a virtual machine. Today you'd call it a game engine, but the term we used at Dynamix was virtual machine, because it's basically you're creating this abstract machine that you can write games for. And then that abstract machine, there's a different platform layer for every different computer, but you basically write the game once and it runs on all computers. So that was the idea of the virtual machine. And so that's when we started sort of creating our own shared technology base that today we would call a game engine. It wasn't quite as formalized as what we think of today as a game engine, but it was common, this common core set of technology. Sometimes on a game, it would branch and you do different versions for this game. You make some modifications or whatever, but it was sort of all working off the same branch. And so that was kind of the sharing that took place on a technical level. And I think that was one of the reasons Dynamix became so successful, because we had sort of stumbled on this idea of saving tons of work by having this game engine underneath everything, this virtual machine. I think that's why we were able to handle a lot of games, because we didn't have to rewrite from scratch every time.
Did you have one virtual machine for the 3D engine stuff and one virtual machine for 2D games like Firestart, Caveman Olympics, and so forth, or Die Hard on the C64 versus the 3D version that came out on DOS? Was it two separate engines, or?
It wasn't. So the 3D stuff was all certainly part of the virtual machine, and maybe some of the low level the 2D graphics, bitmap graphics. So drawing a bitmap. Nowadays, I don't know what they call it nowadays, blitting or whatever. Now it's all done by shader cards, graphics cards, and stuff like that. But so that wasn't quite as formalized, encapsulated into a common, this is the library or whatever. And so there were some tools that were sort of floating around, like Title Maker and stuff like that for building 2D scenes or whatever. But so you'd grab the pieces that were appropriate. So if you're building a game that has no 3D, you're not going to include all the 3D code, because why bloat up the code space? So you wouldn't do that. And if you had some special fancy, vice versa, you wouldn't do it the other way. But even the 3D stuff had a lot of bitmap graphics in it, like in A1010 Killer, there was these explosions, and those were all bitmaps. So we'd still use the 2D stuff in the 3D game as well as all the cockpits and stuff like that. So,
Gotcha. Okay, makes sense. Now, I do have to ask, David Wolf ships as an EGA game. Some of the ads at the time were promising there would be a VGA upgrade that never shipped. What happened there?
Two things. One is it was the cost of goods issue, because David Wolf was so graphics intensive, a lot more than A10 Tank Killer, because David Wolf had all these still shots, that those take up what at the time was a lot of memory. And so they made a decision early on, or well, not early on, but maybe halfway through the project, we can't ship on VGA. There's just going to be way too many discs. This is going to be, it's not even going to, they're not going to all fit in the box. And then the plan was then later on, maybe we'd figure out some compression, or maybe the price of discs would come down. But it didn't matter because David Wolf didn't sell. So why release a VGA version? If it doesn't sell, why are we wasting money on something? So that was the issue. It just didn't sell. So you're not going to spend any more time on it. You're going to move on to the next project. But
Gotcha.
Yeah, it was probably, and it's too bad too, because really that game wanted to be 256. And you saw a better manifestation of the concept later with the games that Jeff worked on, like Heart of China and Blade Runner.
Right?
Rise of the Dragon. Yeah, Rise of the Dragon, right.
Yeah.
Because there they went ahead and used all the full 256.
You could tell the DNA was the same, but the use of the 3D in David Wolf was quite impressive at the time. It just was screaming out this should be in VGA instead of 16 color EGA.
Yeah, that's too bad. I know, it's too bad.
And at this point, throughout this entire description of the company, you've got Jeff. If I'm understanding this correctly, Jeff is doing a lot of the business stuff. He is coming in on some of the development, and there's a lot of projects that you're not involved with, but you still seem to be. Are you managing the big projects at this point? Or are you still very heavy into the code? How is your role in the company evolving at this point?
I was really focused on certain games as sort of running the game, doing all the design and all the management. And we called them directors back then. Our idea of a director was somebody who designs and then manages the project. And a lot of companies didn't work that way. They worked more with producers. So there would be a designer and there'd be a producer. And the producer was basically the project manager. So there'd be a project manager separate from the designer. And like a lot of, like, say, Sierra, their designers, like Roberta and Al Lowe, they didn't manage the project. They were the creative types. And that's, a lot of studios did it that way. And then just because of my background, I started off making games on my own. So I got used to managing a project, as well as having the creative ideas too. And we sort of just followed that mold. I don't know why, because we got other people in too, and we just kept doing it that way. So I would be focused on certain games, really immersed on them and trying to make sure they're great. And then also the technology. Those were sort of the things I did. I was heavily involved in the technology and the development of the virtual machine and a lot of the technologies along the way. We had a lot of really smart people. Dynamix was a really cool place just to walk around and just talk to the programmers, because they just had so many brilliant ideas. And we were all friends, and we'd hang out, and we all love math, and we just talk about problems and how to solve things. And we're constantly coming up with new clever optimizations and how to do compression faster, or just all kinds of cool technologies. So that was my focus, technology and specific games, and say I didn't worry about business stuff as much, hardly at all. Jeff handled all that stuff. So he handled that. And then we had another guy, a finance guy that came in later that was worried about money and stuff. So that was the split, and it worked well, because I didn't know anything about business, and I didn't really want to do that,
No, totally totally understand. Now, with all these tools you guys are developing, was there any was it a business to sell or license those tools to other developers at the time?
We hadn't really thought too much about it. It wasn't a thing that's done like today. In retrospect, it might have been good, but I don't know. The industry was evolving rapidly, and the technology was evolving rapidly. The engines wouldn't last for too long, so maybe there was a business there. At some point, we talked to Microsoft, and they were coming out with their PC. They were coming out with a PC that was going to take over. I can't remember if that ended up being the Peanut or something, but they were going to have their own OS and everything. And we pitched them and said, well, why don't you put our 3-space into your core BIOS or whatever? And they said no. They said, well, we'll just program it ourselves. Why would we have you? We have great programmers here. They were all really like, actually, the guy that we had that meeting with, it was Gabe Newell, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's before he had done his thing. And he was just like, why would we hire you? We have better programmers, It's just like, oh, okay. So anyway, but we that didn't really happen, and then we did end up selling our 3D stuff to Activision for them to make some games with. That was part of the deal with them. So we had our engine that we had used for, say, Abrams battle tank. It was 16-color EGA engine, the same one we used for David Wolf. So we gave that to them for them to use for whatever they wanted. And so they paid us some money for that. I don't remember how much it was.
Okay.
But it was just a little piece of money. What's that?
Do you know which games ended up being used or made with that, if any?
No. They were doing some development, but it's typical that publishers aren't as good at developing just because it's not their thing. I mean, eventually they can buy a studio, and then that studio can do well because it already was a studio. But when they try to do their own internal development, they just have the wrong people. So I don't know what they did with it exactly. They could have. I mean, it was a good technology, but no, we didn't really go down that path. Later on, Jeff was doing a different thing, and that became Garage Games. But that is all based on that concept of selling a game engine. So they had developed a game engine at Dynamix for building tribes. So they used that for the core of Garage Games.
Gotcha. When does the idea of selling the company, and this is another story because I've run across news reports that you're going to be that Dynamix was to work with Sierra and publish through Sierra, that a couple months later the reports get changed into Dynamix is being purchased by Sierra. How did that whole relationship come about?
Jeff had been talking to Ken Williams for a couple years before all that because he was friends. He knew all these guys, and we were always looking for work and stuff. And when we switched and started working with Activision, he had also talked to Ken Williams, and he said, "Oh yeah, we're gonna make 5 games for Activision. We're gonna publish 2 games on our own." And Ken's like, "Yeah, right." He's like, no way can a studio of 25 ship 7 games in 1 year. So the year ended, and Ken was blown away. He couldn't believe that we did it, But we were really good at what we did, and Jeff was still talking to him, and so we were looking for new opportunities. And Jeff's like, "Hey, do you want to help us publish? We want to do more games, and you want to partner with us as an affiliate publisher? Or do you want to invest in us or whatever?" And Ken basically said, "No, I want to buy you." So he had a different idea. We're like, what? Whoa. We hadn't been seeking a sale of the company up to that point. And at first it was sort of a bitter pill to swallow because we're like, no, we like owning our own company. Why do we want to do this? But the more we thought about it, it's like, well, this kind of makes sense, and we trust him. He seems like a good guy, and Sierra does good products, and this has just been a long, hard road we've been on, and we don't have money. Money's still tight even after we published those two games with Activision. A10 was selling well, but not well enough. Our revenues were better, but it was still like, this is tough. We're still having to scramble. And so we just made a deal. It made a lot of sense. And so we did a deal with them, and it worked out really well. It was good. I mean, it could have been crappy, but it wasn't. So, you know what I mean? You could sell. A lot of people have horror stories about getting bought and saying it was the worst thing they ever did, but it wasn't for us. It was fantastic because we grew from 30 people to, 150, 200 people during that period with Sierra, because Ken was very serious. He wanted to build our studio up and make it big and powerful. And our budgets went up. Our team sizes went up by like triple. We had these small teams and they got way bigger. And the project budgets went from, maybe $80,000 up to like $600,000, And so the games just got way better, So it was really cool on a lot of levels, Not just a business level, but a creative level. It was really cool too. But the hard part was sort of saying, well, this isn't ours. We don't own it, And so the way I rationalized it in my mind was I said, well, creatively, we always own it. To the end of time, we're the ones that created these products. So no matter what publisher owns the legal rights to it or whatever, creatively, we're always the authors, And that's got to be the way it is for all kinds of people in the creative industries, actors and things like that. They don't own the movies that they make, But you still feel a kind of creative ownership. So that helps you reconcile it in your mind and not feel like, this sucks. But it didn't suck. It didn't. I really liked working with Sierra. They were fantastic partners.
And so at the time that you guys get purchased by Sierra, what product do you have in the pipeline? Because you just shipped 7 products in a row. So do you have anything in the pipeline at that point?
I can't remember, because we would have had to finish up any contracts we had with other publishers. We wouldn't just, stop them or whatever. So we would have finished up all the projects. I think the one was we canceled V-22 Osprey with Activision because it didn't seem to be going anywhere. So we canceled that. But I can't remember I don't remember exactly when we knew we were going to switch to them, if all those 7 projects had shipped or not. So I don't know the timing or whatever. Because you're right. There must have been a transition where we knew we were going to be bought by Sierra, but we were still working on other projects. Mm-hmm. But then the question is, once we were bought by Sierra, what did we tool up right away? Because suddenly we have all these developers with nothing to work on. So,
well,
one of them was Front Page Sports Football. I know that was one. We hired a guy for that. He was great. Mm-hmm. Another one was Aces of the Deep. Well, actually, I'm still friends with that guy. We're going to go to the coast next week.
Oh, really? 2 weeks. Cool.
Yeah. Mike Jones, he's a great guy.
I'm just looking here at Moby Games real quick. Obviously, A10 Tank Killer gets reissued by Sierra.
Yeah, see, that's an example versus David Wolf. A10 did really well, so of course we keep doing work, making new versions of it. And man, that thing probably sold 500,000 copies amongst all of its iterations, which back then was a lot. Nowadays it's not as much, but
yeah,
back then, 200,000 was good.
And I also see here you guys did motocross for GameStar in '89.
GameStar was, I think, a satellite of Activision.
Ah, okay. I didn't know they had been purchased by Activision at that point. Okay.
I think so. I think so. That was Scott somebody. He was a sports producer guy.
Gotcha. So then,
and then of course, Rise of the Dragon would have been one of the other ones signed.
Heart of China, Red Baron, Heart of the Dragon, Stellar 7, and Nova 9. So the new version.
Stellar 7.
So I gotta ask, was remaking Stellar 7 something that you guys had been planning for a while? Was it something that how do you go back to that original release?
So we had actually had a producer at Electronic Arts pitch us the idea of doing a re-release of Stellar 7. It was Rich Hilleman, who ended up being sort of a big deal there. And we said, yeah, we'll do it. That sounds great. And then it went around, and then Trip Hawkins vetoed it, and he said, we don't do re-releases. We do originals. So he didn't like the idea of associating his brand with, rehash or whatever. But that got the idea in our head, and we said, well, this is something we can do. And so it was probably a thing where Jeff was probably thinking of, we've got to ship products with Sierra. What are we going to ship? So again, I'll credit him for that and just say he probably came up with the idea and said, well, Damon, what can we do on Stellar 7? Why don't we do it? And how can we upgrade it? And probably just had I actually remember the meeting where we were sitting and talking in a restaurant somewhere. And he's just like, why don't we do this? And we just started talking about how we could make a new version of Stellar 7. I'm like, oh, it sounds like a lot of work. He's like, no, it doesn't have to be. Just make it the same game with better graphics, and that's exactly what we did. It was almost the exact same game with better graphics. So it was basically BGA 256 color graphics with some new paintings to show geared racks on the villain. And so it really was just like the easiest project I've ever done. And it sold really well because Sierra was, man, they had a monstrous sales force, so they could sell the crap out of anything.
And curiously enough, because you mentioned previously that you were not happy with the fact that Penguin Software put a screenshot on the cover, Sierra put a screenshot on the cover of Stellar 7.
Yeah, I think it worked. I think it's a question of graphic design and a better screenshot. So the graphic design, I think, for Stellar 7 was, for that version, was way better. And I'd show you the cover, but I realize you're on a podcast and people won't see what I'm showing. So you and I can imagine it.
I actually have it open on my second screen right now, and I have a copy of it also on the shelf someplace. But also, I will be linking to all of these games and all the images and stuff we're talking about in the show notes. So if anybody following along can find the links to it. Now, so you guys are doing a lot of these projects. Which projects are you most involved with in the first year or two at Sierra?
It was Red Baron and Aces of the Pacific almost exclusively. At that point, it was just total focus on those games, plus some work on the technology. But really Red Baron, and then we actually did a little mission builder, Red Baron Mission Builder, which is a little side project, and then Aces of the Pacific. So that's pretty much all I did at that point. Yeah.
Why the focus on the historical simulations?
So that's actually a pretty good story. So the sort of genesis of that was I did Stellar 7, which is a sci-fi tank game. Then when we worked with Electronic Arts, they said historical sells better than sci-fi, which is no longer true, but back then it was. So it's like, let's do Abrams Battle Tank. So I'm like, okay, historical sim, so Abrams Battle Tank. Then the next lesson was flight games do better than tank games, right? Okay, A-10 Tank Killer. And then, we do flight games now. We're doing A-10 Tank Killer. So now we're sort of moving as the market's directing us, And also I just thought for myself, flight games were an interesting challenge because the 3D is a lot more involved and stuff like that. But they just sold, 3 times better, maybe even 5 times better than tank games. And so that's why we did A-10. And then the question is why historical? Well, after A-10, I said I want to do another flight game. And so I had a book called The Great Warplanes. It was a big coffee table book, and it showed all the great warplanes of history. And so I said, I want to do a game called The Great Warplanes, and it's going to have all the great warplanes of history. So it's going to have World War I, World War II, modern jets, and it's going to have them all. It's going to have all of them. And I think EA actually later on, a few years later, did a game called air combat or something like that.
Birds of Prey.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And so thought about doing this whole thing, and I was gonna call it the Great Warplanes because I thought it was a great title. And so I said, this is what I want to do. And so then they pitched the idea to Ken, and Ken wrote me back a really nice letter. And the thing about Ken was he really respected our autonomy as a developer. They weren't a company that's just like going to start telling us what to do, because he believed and we believed that we needed to maintain our creative autonomy for us to be good at what we did. We had to be passionate. I think that's because he was a game developer himself and he understood the passion of the author. And so he wrote back a really nice letter and he said, well, dear Damon, very formal, I've heard this is your idea. I want to let you know something we've learned at Sierra. Sequels sell better than the originals. And so we found that King's Quest 2 sells better than King's Quest 1. King's Quest 3 sells better than King's Quest 2. If you do this one giant game, then there's no room to move forward into the future. So what about doing one part of it? But at the end of the day, I trust you completely, and I leave it completely at your discretion. And very cordially, Ken Williams or whatever. And I sat there and I was just like, I just was reading it alone at my desk, I'm like, he's right. I was like, he's right. Plus, I actually liked it more. I'm like, oh, this is awesome. Like, I didn't think it would get approved to just do World War I, I thought, oh, that's just too small and too niche, But I'm like, I would love to just dive down into one little era of history and just blow it up and make it huge, So that was the reason for doing historical flight simulator and really focusing in on the history and just having that level of detail. It was really, I guess I'd say, it was Ken Williams' idea to switch. I mean, it was going to be somewhat historical because it was going to cover all eras, but we wouldn't have been able to theme the entire game around one era. It would have just had a generic theme. And I think that's why those kind of generic encyclopedia games aren't as good. Like the EA one, you can't get the level of detail. It'd be like doing a movie that covers 100 years. It's like, no, some great movies only cover one day, like Training Day or something. Like you really dive down into the heart of it. So that was the reason for doing historical, and then it could be sequelized, and we did sequelize it. And I think that was a much better approach. So that showed how positive the creative relationship was with Sierra. It was win-win. Yeah. We did better work because of it.
Definitely. It's an interesting one. Now, when you're approaching a program like that, when you're approaching a game like Red Baron, and Red Baron is a major title for Dynamix and Sierra at this point, what was your approach to making this? I mean, you talked about Birds of Prey, the EA game that came out a little bit later. Did you look at any other titles? Because I believe it's the same year or within like an 18-month period, there's 3 big World War I flight sims. There's CinemaWare's Wings, there's Microprose's Knights of the Sky, and there's Red Baron. Were you aware of the other developments going on? Was it something in the air with World War I? What inspired World War I as the place to start? And what other games or research did you do to figure out how it should work?
So there were I think a couple others. Another one was called Blue Max.
Yeah, true.
And I feel like there's another one too. Another one was on the Mac. It might have been called Red Baron. I don't know. It was like a weird it was a really tiny game. No, I wasn't able to play any of those games because they were released in the middle of development of Red Baron. But when they came out, I played them immediately. But when Red Baron was being designed, none of those were out. I think maybe the first was probably Wings. At some point I looked at Wings. I can't remember at what point. But it was a totally different kind of thing. But, I mean, I played every game, so there were tons of games I had played before that, like Chuck Yeager Flight Simulator, Falcon 3.0, but also other genres of games like Pirates and, trying to get the role playing. I played all the Microprose games that had already been released from different eras. So wasn't inspired at all by the other World War One games, but was certainly aware of every game that had gone before, because at that point I was a student of games, and so you study everything, you play everything, but then you also research other media. You watch all the movies on World War One. You can find every single, including that old Howard Hughes movie that he made, and in magazines and books and Janes and just everything you can find, journals of the actual pilots from the war, that you could actually get their diaries and read their daily thoughts and stuff. So total immersion. And about other games coming out, we became aware that other games were coming out, and it was scary because it's like, oh no, we have more competitors, and you keep thinking their game's going to be better. You're like, oh no, ours is not going to be as good. Theirs is going to be way better. No one's going to want to play our game. Oh no, theirs already launched. Because we want to be first to market, but we weren't going to ship it early. And then we were most afraid of the Microprose game, Knights of the Sky. We were most afraid of that one until it was released, and then we weren't. Once we played it, we're just like, no, we don't have anything to worry about. But we're like, oh man, maybe we just totally missed the mark because we don't understand the market at all. Because it had a totally different approach. It was really kind of cutesy. We're like, oh, maybe people want the cutesy approach, And so, it was really scary. And Microprose was actually vying with us for the trademark to the name Red Baron. So we were lucky that we beat them to the trademark office by, I think, a few hours or something.
Oh,
so
wow.
Otherwise we would have been, the name of the game would have been Knights of the Air. That was our backup. Not Knights of the Sky, but it would have been Knights of the Air. That would have been the name of our game if they had gotten Red Baron.
Oh, wow. You didn't have any problems with the old Atari Red Baron arcade game? That didn't become an issue?
It had lapsed because it wasn't out there, and there was no challenge. And there was no challenge that came. The question would have been whether or not it would have applied, because there's this idea with trademarks of different industries. So it depends on whether or not they would have considered computer games different than old stand-up coin art games. It would be tough. It would be a tough case to win. But I think it had lapsed. It wasn't. So for a trademark to exist, you have to have an active product in the market. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it goes away. Like if you're not using it to make money, you lose your trademark. So, but it never came up. So we ended up. Microprose tried to claim they had the trademark to the Atari version, but they didn't. So they had said they had somehow bought the trademark or something, but they didn't. So probably at that point, Sierra's lawyers looked into it for us, because that was one of the advantages of having a publisher. They take care of these things for you.
Very cool. Yeah.
So we were terrified, and we were really terrified when the Computer Gaming World review of Knights of the Sky came out, and they loved it. They said, "Oh, this is fantastic," and we're like, "What the heck are they seeing?" Because it didn't appeal to me. I'm not saying it was a terrible game, but it just wasn't my kind of approach. I'm just like, this isn't my deal, and I don't get it. There were certain things about the graphics on their game that I actually liked a lot that were really nice, but and then our game came out, and the reviewers really didn't like our game that much. Sort of gave it a B- or something in Computer Gaming World, and I think they actually gave Knights of the Sky a higher rating because the same guy reviewed both, and we're just like, what the heck? But then the sales numbers started coming in, and we're like, oh, this is a hit. So then everything was happy in the end for us.
Yeah, you guys also had the much better packaging. I mean, the artwork on Knights of the Sky was a plane in the background, and then a photo of these two smiling guys in World War I Air Force uniforms, and you're just like, yeah, okay. I think you said it best with this cutesy.
Yeah,
didn't really capture the grittiness of the environment.
Yeah, I just didn't feel like that game loved the era. We loved the era. We loved it. I mean, we loved it, and it was a serious time. I mean, these were real people. These weren't cute guys having fun in the sky. These were guys that were thinking about, I might die today. This sucks. It's hard, you know. Like the Germans ended up having to do 2 flights a day, some of them. And the thing is, every time they go up into the air, they're freezing and they have hypoxia. I mean, they eventually lost their mental faculties over time, where they were just these walking zombies, you know, just they couldn't think straight. And that's probably why the Red Baron got shot down. He was so out of it. Anyway, no, we loved the era. So I felt like, so that was part of, and then in the end, Computer Gaming World ended up putting us in the Hall of Fame. So I felt like they eventually recognized that it was a good product.
Yeah, definitely. Now, so you're doing the flight sims. You move on to the Aces series, but at some point you decide to leave Dynamix. How does that decision come about?
Well, there was sort of a couple of things going on. One was we had a buyout clause with Sierra where we had to basically work for 5 years to earn our buyout money. And then there was, I think it was 3 years of a buyout and then 2 years of having an exclusive with them. And so I just wanted to fulfill the whole 5 years, you know. I think I could have left after 3 years if I wanted. But I was, you know, it was a pretty good job. It was fun. I liked what I was doing. But I'd always thought from the very beginning of Dynamix, I'll do this for a while and then I'll go do something else. So it was always in the back of my mind. And so and it was fun, but it was tough. I mean, there was a lot of, you know, 60, 70, 80-hour weeks, you know, and just constant grind. And after a while, you don't have any personal life at all. I mean, your personal life is your work life. So, you know, you got a lot of great friends, but it's just, you see the same people at work. And you go to lunch, you go to dinner, you know, you go out for drinks. You're just living in the world. And I was just like, man, there's got to be more to life than this, you know. I need to go do some other stuff. So I always wanted to get my degree, and I always wanted to live somewhere else. So that's why I left. I just felt like part of it was I just didn't want to feel I didn't want to just be chasing success, you know, and money and not looking at other parts of your life, you know, because I knew I would make more money if I stayed at Dynamix. And so it's like, well, if I just want to go for money, just stay here and just keep grinding it out, you know. But I think in a way if I was as old as I am now, I would know how to do it right at Dynamix and fulfill all those other parts without losing the good job at Dynamix, you know. So that was my reason. I just wanted to go. I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to go live somewhere else, get my pilot's license, just do a lot of traveling, that kind of thing. So that was what that was all about, just sort of trying to explore other parts of life.
Very cool. After obtaining your pilot's license,
yes,
after leaving Dynamix, did you learn anything from that experience that you wish you had known while making flight sims like Red Baron?
You know, actually, I don't think so. I wish I could say yes. I don't really think so because some of the things you learn as a pilot are sort of mundane compared to air combat, you know. So I guess one thing that surprised me was because I had, you know, built all these dogfighting games, and I, you know, was used to doing loops and all these kind of crazy maneuvers. I'm like, okay, I'm pretty good at that, you know. So I want to do aerobatics. But once I learned to fly, I was like, no, I don't want to do any aerobatics. You know, as they say, keep the dirty side down. That's the side with the landing gear and the flaps. It's like keep the dirty side down, you know, facing the ground, because you just sort of don't want to get into a weird attitude. I mean, it's safe if you do it carefully or whatever, but you have to have an airplane that's rated for that, you know. Like loops are really dangerous, you know. A roll is actually a lot safer than a loop. So I probably could have done a roll, you know, in my airplane, and I think it would have been okay. Although even there, you got to think about it because anything that's loose in the cockpit is going to fall, could hit you on the head or something, you know. If you had some wrench sitting there, it could knock you out, you know. So you
Oh
gotta.
wow, yeah. Didn't even think about that. It makes perfect sense. I think there was a scene in in the movie Hot Shots where they made fun of that, where he rolls and there's suddenly playing cards and stuff flying all over the cabin. But
Yeah. Well, I usually had a little oxygen canister, and that could have flown up and hit me in the head, knock you out, and then you die. You know, 'cause you crash. So it was. I was like, no, I'm not doing any of that crazy stuff. So I got more into the other part of flying, which is instrument flying. You know, which is more precision and very careful, slow, deliberate maneuvers. You know, yeah, I don't think so. I wouldn't even really have modified the flight models that much based on it. You know.
gotcha. And you will go back and you got your bachelor's degree.
Yeah, I got my bachelor's in, I think it was in math with a minor in computer science. Yeah.
Nice. And so at what point do you say to yourself, okay, or did you have any other kind of career path, but after Dynamix and before getting back into games? Did
No.
you do anything professionally, or you were just basically a student and enjoying life?
Yeah, I moved down to San Francisco for a while and just thought about what would I like to do. And I sort of always thought maybe I'd like to start another game studio, you know, but just never really got around to it. But a game that we started playing while I was still at Dynamix was called Kingdom of Drakkar. Almost no one's ever heard of it. It was the first graphical MUD.
Okay.
And it was a graphical MUD, so I would call it the first MMO. I think it's the first MMO ever. It often doesn't get recognized as such because it didn't have a large user base. But it was a graphical MUD, and I think it basically had all the essential elements of a fantasy MMO. And we loved playing it. It was cool. You know, maybe had a community of maybe 300 players only, you know.
Wow.
But it was a lot of grind. Basically, every complaint and praise you have for an MMO you would have found from the player base in Drakkar because they basically did it first. So I'd always wanted to do a fantasy MMO, going way back actually to like 1980 when I started Stellar 7. I also thought maybe I should do a fantasy game instead. So I thought about doing something like that, but I ended up doing Stellar 7. So I'd always sort of wanted to do that. And so it was always in the back of my mind to start a game studio and then work on a different kind of game, you know, just for variety. So, but I wasn't really actively really pursuing it.
Okay.
I was just sort of traveling around, scuba diving, you know, doing fun stuff.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with that. You had earned it at that point. And so when you do decide to get back into gaming, what was that process like?
So this would have been around 2006 or 2007. And I realized I wasn't happy doing nothing. So I was depressed. I was very depressed. I got very depressed because I didn't have any purpose anymore in life, right? And so I would get up and I would just sit there and like, I don't have anything to do. This is stupid, you know? And so it's like I went too far from one extreme to the other. And so I'm like, for a while, it was fun. It was great. I was doing all this kind of stuff or whatever. And then I got really depressed and I said, what am I doing? I actually remember liking to build games. I like working on a team with other creative people. You know, it's fun to build stuff. It's fun to have a challenge, you know, and work towards something. And maybe a better word than fun is meaningful. It's meaningful. It gives you meaning in your life to do it. And I think it's a cliche, but it's true. You really need to have different parts to your life. You need to have family, you know, and you have to have work. You really need family and work. So you work on the family part. You know, all you're doing is the work part, and the family parts dies, right? Like at Dynamix. And then I'm unfulfilled, and then I switched all the way to the other way. It's like I'm only going to focus on my personal life, but now I've lost the work part, and so I think both. And so that was a realization that I needed to get back into games. This is the worst. I hate this. This is terrible. I'm not doing anything. What am I doing? Everybody else is out doing stuff. And so I'm like, I want to get back into games. And I just happened to bump into Jeff on the street, the same guy I told you about earlier. Just literally in my car, he walks in front of me and I'm like, oh, hey, Jeff. And he says, hey, you want to get back into games? I got a project, or I got a new opportunity. And I'm like, yeah, because it was exactly when I was thinking about doing it. And I said, yeah, I do. I really do. And he said, okay, let's talk. And so then we started talking, and they were in the process of selling their company, and they had a ton of money to fund development with. And so that's how I got started. It was just perfect timing of when I really needed to get back into games. And so that's when I started Villagers and Heroes as a project for instant action. It was Garage Games, and then it became instant action. And then also Ace of Aces was another project I did for them. So that's what got me back in.
Cool. And so you're getting back in. You've got a source of funding for it. Are you running your own teams at this point? How has, in that period of time, how has the structure of development changed? Are these now employees? Are you farming out the assets to third parties? How does your development look today?
So it's mostly employees. So we started our own game studio, and our size would vary between 3 people and 8 people, go up and down like that over time. Development originally was funded by an advance from Instant Action. Well, not an advance. It was actually, it's kind of hard to explain what it was, but it was a development fee. Basically, they gave us a development fee. It wasn't an advance, so we didn't have to pay it back. It's a development fee, and then we get royalties on the back end. So it avoided the whole Peter to pay Paul problem, because you're not in debt, but it pays for development. And so mostly development is all done in-house, but sometimes we will hire an artist to do some assets for us. Not most of it's done in-house, but say for instance we've got some paintings that we've been putting in the games lately, so we hire a painter from somewhere she does some really nice pieces for us, because you don't really want to staff a full-time painter in-house when our studio's that small, because painters are really different than 3D artists. And some assets we just buy off the Unity asset store. Sometimes we'll just be like, well, we need a new horse mount, for the players to be on or whatever. So we just buy a good one off the Unity asset store, but then we incorporate it into the game, and we have to change the texture around and kind of hook it up and everything like that to make it fit the style of the game. But where we can, we will buy stuff if it's possible. But for the most part, it's all custom, We're using a game engine. It's actually the Torque game engine, which is the one that came out of Garage Games, which came out of Dynamix.
Villagers and Heroes. Now, this is not like your old games where you put discs in a box and you ship it. How has digital distribution and constant updates to the game change the way that you approach development and approach design and planning?
So it's pretty big change, because before it was what would have been called waterfall approach to software development, which is you basically do a complete design of the game up front, like every detail. That's the way we did it at Dynamix. And as much as you can lock it down, you're going to save time. You're like, this is exactly what we're going to build over the next year, and then you build it. You don't fill in like every line of text, like whatever, but basically you spec it out in great detail, and the designs might be like 100 pages, Now, the model that people use is what they call agile. It's a term that's probably overused, and we probably don't do it exactly agile because I don't want to be too formal. But basically, it's based on iteration. You say, what's a little minimum feature set we can build it? Just a minimum feature set that we can build, and now we can play and evaluate, internally. Okay, don't add all the fancy features, because maybe you build this little feature set and you realize, oh, this one feature, this one part of it isn't really that good. Let's just cut it. Whereas if you designed it all up front, you might have spent, weeks and weeks making it better and better, and then you cut it. So instead, it's iteration. To go, okay, this is good. Let's keep doing more here. That's internally, but then externally, you also try to get stuff live in front of players quicker to see how they respond. And then that's part of the iteration. So if you can get like a small test a feature out, get it out to the players, if they respond, then you do more features on it later to expand the idea out. If it's not very good, or you can just tell it's not working, then you don't do any more. So there's a lot of there's a feedback loop, and it helps direct design. It's kind of like that guy, Jonathan Deming, was this guy who talked a lot about quality and manufacturing, talked about the virtuous circle where you start with product design, it goes all the way down through production or whatever. At the end, you have customer feedback, and then it pushes back into the beginning, which is product design, and kind of coming up with that idea, and that's now commonplace. Whereas a game like Red Baron, you can't. It's out. It's gone. It's in the box. It's done. You can't change it, Maybe you can learn from your mistakes on the next game you do, But when you're online, you're actually getting the feedback every minute of every day from players. And they're telling you what's wrong, and you can just fix it on the next build that comes 2 weeks later,
Gotcha.
So it's way better.
You have a studio, you have people there, and obviously the MMO space is an interesting one from a business management standpoint. Is that continuous loop that you talked about of reacting to what the players do? How does that feel? Having been somebody who worked on so many projects in such short period of time, so many of those products being very, very different from one another, but now you're working on essentially the same game with small iterations over time. Is that a different feeling of fulfillment? Is it better than the old system because you get to spend more time on that product? You don't just have to abandon it to move to the next one, or do you miss the variety of development on multiple products?
I think it's mixed. In some ways it's better, and in some ways it's worse. It's really just different, And so I think for some people they would probably like it not as much because they want to move on to the next thing and do something else and do something different or whatever. But I don't mind it. I like that kind of focus. I mean, that's kind of like how I like doing Red Baron, because it was focusing down on one era, and really it's the same thing, really focusing in on this thing over years. You're building it. I mean, this is certainly the biggest game I've ever built by an order of magnitude or two even. It's just massive at this point, But I mean, it's also fun to ship a game, have it go out there, see how it's received, and then go on to the next game. That's fun too. So I don't even really think in my mind. I don't really think about. I don't compare the two when I'm thinking about it. But I do know I don't mind what I'm doing now. I like it. I like this kind of focus, and I also like just knowing that you're on stable footing. The game's already successful. So you've already proven that it works, and so then you're just like, how do we make it better, Whereas when you're doing a new project, you're like, what if the core gameplay sucks, You're like, it's funny. I remember even on Red Baron, I was talking to one of the programmers on Red Baron, and he got really dejected one day. He goes, I don't understand. You're just flying in circles trying to shoot this other plane. No one's going to like it, Because he had been working on it for so long, and he's like, "Oh, what if nobody wants to play it?" And I was just like, "Oh, I was like, no, I think it's fine. It'll be fine, because as long as there's planes that are really easy to shoot, versus planes that are too hard, pilots, it's going to be fun or whatever, But there is you get those fears on when you're building something from scratch, like, oh, am I totally insane? What am I thinking? No one's going to want this. This is garbage. I heard a story about Francis Ford Coppola looking at screens of The Godfather, the daily viewings. They're like, this is terrible. He goes, this is just a bunch of old men talking in dark rooms. No one wants to watch this crap. So you have those kinds of feelings. So one of the nice things about something like Villagers and Heroes is we know we're already past that. We know we have tons of loyal players behind us that just love what we're doing, and they're so supportive. So that's cool. They're so supportive. Our game was hacked we were down for about 2 to 4 weeks. Ooh. And our players were behind us 100%. And that's just, we wouldn't have made it without their support. Emotionally it would have been like, let's just give up. They're like, no, we're here. We're not going anywhere. We're just waiting, keep going. So that's pretty cool. So there's a lot of advantages too. Mm. Plus you have a steady revenue stream too, You're not having to worry about Peter to pay Paul.
I was about to ask the revenue stream structuring and the planning for how you're going to monetize the game. How complex was that? How big was the learning curve for you on that?
It was just like any other new project where you have to do a lot of research to understand the new model of free to play, and so it's the same kind of thing where you immerse yourself, you read all the articles you can on free to play. What is free to play? Tons of articles, and they're people throw around all these terms all the time, and after a while you realize there's a lot of BS out there, like they don't even define the terms the same from day to day, ARPU, ARPDAO, RPPU, all these kind of terms, KPIs, blah, 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 but you still have to immerse yourself in all that crap. And then you have to go look at other games and play a ton of other games that are free to play. Actually get addicted to some other games because you can't really understand until you actually get addicted, because you want to understand, well, how does this work? So I played other games that were free to play and tried to figure out what are those loops and how do they work and how do you monetize, So that's really, it's just like anything else. You just got to research it, and then you release your game and you're not monetizing very well. You thought you were, you took your best first effort, but then you just look at all the metrics and you say, well, what's selling, what's not, why is it selling? What do players want? What do players want to spend money on? And they're trying to balance. One of the hardest things is making sure it's not pay to win. So you're like, because people don't really like pay to win. At least in the West, they don't like pay to win. In Asia, they prefer pay to win because it's a status symbol. It's like, well, if I can just spend money and do well, that's great, But in the West, that's not a good strategy because it's seen as unfair. So you want to find things that people are willing to spend money on that don't get perceived as being overly pay to win. And the problem is pay to win has a definite gameplay value, so it's easier to sell stuff that's pay to win, right? So if you're just selling something, so you can sell cosmetics, but cosmetics don't sell as well as things that have pay to win. So the philosophy we had on this game was customization. We sell customization, convenience, and small advantages. So small advantages is where you get into the pay to win territory. We're like, okay, if we make the advantages small, then they'll be acceptable. And so we do things like, your damage is boosted by 5% or whatever if you have this one thing. But we don't sell 50 things like that because that would be pay to win. Like if you had 50 things that boosted it by 5%, it's like, oh, there's one thing that you can buy that boosts your damage by 5%. It's not very big, and we just assume all players are going to buy it, But customization, which basically is cosmetics, those are always acceptable. And then convenience is basically time-saving things that you can sell people so that maybe they can do something in 1/10 the amount of time, And then that's okay. So in a way, that is sort of pay to advance but it's like, well, if you want to save some time in real life so you don't have to click a million times or whatever, So you have to find ways to make money or you go out of business. So you just figure that's just part of the deal you're making with the players. On their side, the advantage they're getting is they get to try the game for free before they spend $40 and say, oh, I hate this thing, So they get some advantages, but then the people that end up liking it will end up spending more than $40, So that's kind of how that's sort of the deal you're making with the public,
Gotcha. And how has the international market for the game, or what's the international makeup of the market for the game?
I think
Primarily North America, or?
Yeah, our revenues are probably at least 50% in North America. Maybe 60% of the revenue is. Part of that's just because the U.S. has a lot of people, and the other part is U.S. players have a lot of money. We do have players in Europe. We have a pretty good German presence because we had a partner in Germany for a while. We still have them or whatever, but they were involved in publishing it. And so we have a pretty good German presence. We have some players. I mean, we have players everywhere pretty much in the world. But in terms of the larger, I mean, we have basically everywhere in the world we have players. Pretty much Australia, China, Japan, Korea, small places you've never heard of, but not a lot. So, you're going to have, basically it's going to be proportional to the population of the country, except for China. We do have Chinese players, but it's certainly not our biggest population because of the various bans that the Chinese government puts on games being allowed to be played in China. So we're there, but players that play our game are playing it through VPNs and stuff because they can't have direct access to it. Because otherwise we could be spreading propaganda, which we're not, but we're worried about it, But so, yeah, I would say the U.S. is our biggest market. But we've got some players in South Korea and China and Europe be the other territories that are significant. Actually, we have a nice little Brazilian population too. We had localized it to Portuguese at some point, and so we got a population in Brazil. It was kind of nice.
Very cool. Now, do you ever see yourself going back to single-player game experiences?
Yeah, I've thought about doing another Red Baron. We tried to do a Kickstarter, but it didn't do very well. I don't think we did very well. I think is why the Kickstarter didn't do well. So something like that would be fun to do again. I had some other ideas. I can't remember what they are right now, but yeah, I could see doing a single player game. But even like if I did a Red Baron, there would be a single player focus, but then there would also be at some point there would have to be a multiplayer component too, because I just think if you do all that work, you may as well do some really good multiplayer stuff too, because it's more fun to fly against people.
Definitely true. Well, it's not the first time Red Baron was multiplayer. I mean, did you work on the multiplayer version for the Imagination Network?
No, I sort of watched it a little bit because it was going on at Dynamix, and that was before we did Red Baron 2, Red Baron 3D. So I was gone when we did Red Baron 2 and Red Baron 3D, which were full multiplayer. But I watched it a little bit, and I sort of became disenchanted because I tested it at one point, and I was dogfighting a guy, and I could see him in my sights, and I was almost hitting him with my bullets, and then he shot me down. Well, he was behind me on his computer. On my computer, he was in front of me. So I'm just like, oh, the internet's not ready for this yet. Latency's too high. It's too early. So that was sort of why I shied away from multiplayer. I thought it was a little bit earlier. I think maybe a few years after I left, it actually made sense because the internet was there.
Gotcha. We're getting towards the end of this. There's a question I ask all of my interview subjects. Looking back at your career, what would you say is one trend in the industry that you thought was going to be huge that ended up just fizzling out, didn't go anywhere? And what is one trend that became huge that you did not see coming, that caught you by surprise?
Well, the trend that caught everyone by surprise was the internet, I think, except for actually Ken Williams, because he was there early with the Imagination Network, and he was too early. He was too early. He was too visionary, because that would have been huge. That would have been huge if he could. And he knew it. If you read his biography, he talks about it. He says, oh, just a little early. And if he'd kept it going, it would have been just massive. And he was right. It would have been massive. But the internet really, especially for games, not only distribution, so distribution and multiplayer experiences. And then even, no, I don't think mobile caught me by surprise, because I remember the first time I saw an iPad, I was like, oh my God, that I could do such an awesome game on an iPad. And there weren't any games on it yet, and I got, oh, this would be perfect for doing like a real-time strategy game. You know, this would be amazing. And then what trend did I see that failed? Was that the question?
Yeah, basically, yeah. Where you thought this is going to be the next big thing, and it just didn't go anywhere.
Well, I definitely was drinking the Kool-Aid from Electronic Arts about the Amiga. You know, I thought this will be the gaming this will be the platform. It's going to just destroy everything. So that was just a big fail. I still liked building the game, and it was fun, and they paid us for it. So I'm not mad at them or whatever, but that was certainly a big fail. You know, I mean, the Amiga was a fail. You know, I mean, in a way, it was a success. Creatively, it was a success. You know, it was a cool machine, and you got to admire all those people that worked on it. But it was too bad that it basically fizzled and died out, you know, and it became a non-viable platform for publishing games on, which was really a shame, because it was obviously a lot better than the competitors at the time. But it wasn't nearly as good as the hype. That was the thing we found when we developed Arctic Fox for the Amiga. We realized this is not nearly as fast as they say it is. It's got all kinds of performance problems. Once you go to solid fill graphics, you've basically destroyed your entire advantage of having a faster chip. You know, so you're back to where you were. It's just it's solid fill instead of wireframe. You know, so that was we worked so hard to get the frame rate up on that. It was so tough. So anyway, but that's usually how it is with new technology. It's never quite as good as people think it is, you know.
Sad but true.
Yeah, it was a good machine too. I mean, the 68000 was a nice chip, and it was pretty impressive in a lot of ways. But still, it wasn't as good as they said, and we found that out the hard way. That's the only thing I can think. I'm sure there's thousands of things, but I just can't remember them right now.
No, those are two perfect examples. Damon, thank you so much. Do you have any parting thoughts for current or past fans of your work?
No, it's fun. Thanks for playing games. It's fun. It's a fun thing to do. It's fun to make games. I'll tell you that.
That's perfect, actually, as a closing line, because if it wasn't fun to play games, it would be very, very sad.
Yeah, it's definitely fun to work with a team of creative people for building games too. Mm-hmm. You know, so like I actually don't like playing my own games. I do it. You have to play test because you have to make sure they're good, but you don't end up enjoying it anymore because it's just work. You know, but it's cool that other people like the games.
Well, what are you playing right now then?
I play chess. That's kind of my top game. I've been playing Hearthstone. I like that because it's easy and casual, and I can relax. You know, I can just play it on my phone and relax. So I just play chess and Hearthstone on my phone right now. Cool. There's some other games I wanted to check out. Like, I'll check out games for research sometimes if I hear there's something. Like when I was starting Villagers and Heroes, I played a ton of fantasy and MMO games, social MMOs. I played like Animal Crossing and Harvest Moon and Habbo Hotel and Club Penguin, like a lot of games you wouldn't think of, but they were social MMOs and trying to understand. So I'll do that, but it's not the same thing as really immersing yourself in a game and loving it, you know. It's been a long time since I've really done that. That was probably like, I don't know, Half-Life 2 or something from a long time ago where I just got totally immersed, kind of like the way you were talking.
Yeah, and those experiences don't come around that often, I guess, especially nowadays. But when they do, there's a magic in that immersion that no other medium, I think, can give us. And the people who can create those moments for us, that's just an art form in and of itself that needs to be appreciated more than it sometimes is.
Yeah.
Okay. Damon, thank you so very much. And I appreciate your time. And your games, and like I said on many occasions, Project Firestart is still my number one game of all time, and I have you to thank for that in large part. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to tell the team. You said that. I'm still friends with some of them.
Oh, please do. Please do. It's, yeah. I'm just, let me stop the recording. I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.